Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, as documents regarding the Alberton spill became available, Lucinda Hodges and Deborah Griffin scrutinized them for information to explain why they were still ill. Meanwhile, they heard from Roger Chalmers, who began his own investigation into the spill in hopes to explain his illness. We now continue with Part 3, Chapter 4, Anniversary. Hodges abandoned Alberton, but not the cause, as many others experienced worsening symptoms with the arrival of spring. The office became a triage center to organize help for the families who were suffering serious health problems and chronic illnesses, she wrote. Spring complaints included chest pain, joint pain, severe migraines, severe nausea and vomiting, facial swelling, skin rashes, bloody sinuses, asthma-like attacks, eye problems, memory loss, and depression. Similar to the previous year, but surging. Hodges heard that 3 people with breathing attacks were hospitalized in March. ACCEH wrote in an open letter, "As the first anniversary of the spill approaches, all is not well. We are sick, unemployed, bankrupt. And above all, we do not want this to happen to any other community." The March thaw catalyzed illness, anger, and desperation. As a warm-up for the first anniversary on April 11, ACCEH planned a small rally at MRL's Missoula headquarters to publicize complaints. On March 24th, about 15 people gathered from some of the sickest families, galvanized by financial problems, Hodges said. Their first direct action. These people, she said, especially the Shuggs and the Garsts, they knew that it was over for them. They had disconnect notices. We all knew eventually we're going to be like Nancy Shugg and Kim Garst. We're going to be the ones packing up and leaving town. That's what it was about, to try and get some relief, so people could have a house and some food. The band of protesters descended upon MRL headquarters on North Reserve Street in Missoula, hoping to talk with someone. When I got there, Hodges said, there was a huge scene happening. The security guards had met everyone in the parking lot, and everyone had started yelling. It must have gone from 0 to 60 quick. When 10-year-old Hannah Garst started crying, Hodges' 70-year-old mother, Catherine, got upset. She said, "Screw this," and my mom started walking. The security guards were afraid to stop her. She got in. The security, they came to the door of MRL and they said, "She won't leave. We're going to have to call the police." But she did leave. Her mom came out proudly holding up a sticky note on her palm. The feeling of triumph was short-lived. They told my mother that they're no longer responsible for our problems and to call this 800 number because these people were, Hodges said, an insurance company in Tennessee. We were not people or fellow Montanans anymore. We were unresolved insurance claims. So much for the long haul, she said. The media paid some notice. People's problems have just escalated, Hodges was quoted in the Missoulian. They simply need to be relocated. They shouldn't stay in Alberton. Hodges reportedly knew of 10 families with severe problems. MRL spokesperson Linda Frost responded that 80% of claims had been settled, and they were working to resolve, quote, a few remaining cases. There were ultimately over 2,000 claims. 20% meant 400 unsettled claims. The university student paper, the Montana Kaiman, quoted Hannah Garst, "My mom's sick. I'm sick. I'm tired of hearing her throw up every day. I'm tired of hearing her cough." Her mother, Kim, said, "I've gone from a strong, independent woman who supported her 2 kids alone to a welfare mom." Steve Shugg said he couldn't work his machinist job because of spill-related migraines that required medication that made him dizzy and have tremors. "They promised us that they would take care of everything," Hodges said. "People don't treat their dogs the way MRL treats the people in Alberton." MRL's Frost responded, "When tests are coming back saying there's no chemicals, no, it's not a possibility to move them for relocation. Until they stop ignoring us, we'll be back," Kim Garst promised. Her daughter carried a sign proclaiming, "Alberton still toxic," with a photo of resident Jabe Jackson's neotoxicosis sculpture. The group dubbed the metallic woman struggling to breathe Chlorina. Hodges recalled, "We went to MRL trying to beg them to help people financially, and they wouldn't even let us in the door. It was horrible. But that's what started the rallies and the protests, was the terrible deprivation in people's lives. While MRL told the press there were no residual chemicals left behind, and Montana DEQ's Tom Ellerhoff assured no lingering contamination and that any smell was creosote from new track ties, an MRL press release of April 7, 1997, that was either never distributed or never published by the media, acknowledged more. Plaintiff attorneys later discovered the document written by Frost, which quoted MRL President William Brodsky. The press release said the derailment area was completely clean, but added, quote, while there are some fertilizer-type odors remaining at the derailment area, especially with spring weather, Brodsky stated that the smell is from harmless mercaptans that were in the spilled potassium cresslate. The smell is not chlorine, and it is not anything harmful, stated Brodsky. Brodsky added, unfortunately, the smell has a tendency to linger, but spring rain should continue to help reduce this odor. Brodsky later told attorneys the statement was based on information from MRL's environmental contractors and the state and county agencies involved. He added, some of our people had noticed fertilizer-type odors that April. The press release was remarkable in that MRL admitted a full year after the spill that the site still off-gas contaminants. Brodsky identified the fertilizer-like smell as, quote, harmless mercaptans, but mercaptans smelled of sulfur, and the pesticide or weed and feed smell was emitted from phenols and chlorinated phenols. Years later, Ellen Leahy was surprised at MRL's statement. Ellerhoff, on the other hand, already knew after soil removal that the site still smelled and contained residual contamination that met regulatory ingestion standards. Many residents smelled the smell, generally reported as a pesticide or fertilizer odor long after the spill, even for years. People noted the smell miles from the site, particularly after rains. Complaints blossomed in the spring of 1997, as if breaking hibernation with snowmelt and warming days. The Shugs and Garth spent several more days protesting at MRL headquarters. Hodges supported them when she could. In late March, Dave Garth wrote up a residents' petition addressed to the governor, Montana's congressional representatives, and MRL owner Dennis Washington. We demand the governor of Montana remove and or force MRL to at once relocate any family in this area who is sick and willing to be relocated. When Jabe Jackson signed the petition, he added, Dear Governor Roscoe, we are damn near broke from all this disaster that MRL caused. Please do something. Jackson also wrote Roscoe directly, explaining that he had recently sold his home at a loss and moved to Missoula. MRL, he said, refused to recognize the loss of equity in her house in Alberton, and have now refused to pay medical bills, prescriptions. We are at a loss as to why our state government doesn't respond to our needs, he emphasized. Governor Roscoe wrote a letter in reply, which DEQ's Ellerhoff had Chris Weiss vet. Because of test results, the letter said, investigators are having a difficult time attributing illnesses and disorders to the accident. The statement was sweeping in its blanket dismissal of spill-related illness. Concerning investigators' difficulty, Weiss penciled to Ellerhoff, Tom, some individuals who were severely exposed to chlorine gas and vapor during early hours of the incident may be expected to suffer longer-term effects. Let's discuss, Weiss wrote. In fact, there was no investigation by anyone into the surge of complaints of illness and odors in the Alberton-area that spring. Now would have been the logical time to conduct air sampling. The governor's letter concluded that no additional sampling was needed. Likewise, he said, public health officials to date have not found evidence that would lead to spending additional funds on further investigation. For Montana, case closed. The same week of the MRL headquarters protest, ACCEH descended upon the office of Senator Max Baucus in downtown Missoula. Baucus had done nothing after his aides attended the conference call of November, and ACCEH hoped to shame him into action. While the Missoulian ignored the protest, Hodges always sent press releases, some alternative coverage developed. A friend of Hope Seeks, fellow environmental studies graduate student Lisa Mosca, heard about the Alberton incident after arriving in Missoula in the fall of 1996. She showed up with a video camera when some dozen protesters swarmed inside Baucus's office and picketed on the street. As an activist, she would strongly advocate for victims while making a documentary film of their story as her graduate thesis. Mosca briefly interviewed the Shuggs during the protest. The family still lived in Alberton, barely. The Shuggs and their 3 teenage boys had health problems ever since re-entry. I recently started reacting with the melting of the snow in the beginning of this month of March, Nancy Shugg said. I went to a doctor and he put me on an inhaler. I have reactive airways disease. We're still sick and we need to be relocated. The sad part about it is we can't work anymore, and that's why I wanted to bring this to Mr. Baucus's attention. MRL is not in it for the long haul like they said, Steve Shugg said. Our life doesn't mean anything to them. We just want to get well, Nancy told Mosca. That's it, Steve pleaded. Getting my health back. I don't want a dime. Just give me my health back. It's got to start with somebody with some power, like Mr. Baucus. Somebody's got to help us. I can't deal with it anymore. Mosca also interviewed Robbie Flynn of Sawmill Gulch, who confirmed a surge in odor and symptoms that spring. Flynn was upset with the lack of media coverage. Why don't any of the newspapers cover this? She asked. Flynn had hoped lessons from Alberton could help other communities. We haven't been able to help ourselves yet, she lamented to Mosca. Living in Missoula was really hard, she said, after living close to paradise. Mosca had found a topic for her thesis, and spill victims would soon find a passionate advocate. Like the Shuggs, the Garsts seemed on the verge of losing it all that spring. Kim Garst's family lived on Ponderosa Acres, almost 5 miles from the spill site. She reported a pesticide-like smell on April 11, 1996, and went to the ER with difficulty breathing. A second exposure during the April 13 animal rescue left Garst feeling much worse. Subsequently, working at the Stone Container Pulp Mill triggered vomiting and flu-like symptoms. In October of 1996, Garst began getting dizzy around production equipment and almost fell. She lost her well-paying job. Garst had worked for Stone Container for 12 years, but her health problems began after the spill. In litigation, a psychologist evaluation noted she now fell within the impaired range in a neuropsychological battery of tests, and found her to be depressed, anxious, and overwhelmed. An MRL-referred neurologist prescribed Imitrex for her severe headaches. He said it's all in my head, Garst testified. Dr. Kay Kilburn reportedly found 17 abnormalities in Garst in his 1996 neurophysiological testing battery. Kilburn didn't think the problem was all in her head. According to medical testimony, in April of 1997, Garst still had a chronic cough, dizziness, severe headaches, sinus problems, extreme fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and numbness throughout her body. She would forget what she's doing or what she had just read, slurred words, and was more emotional, fearful, paranoid, and dependent. She also had episodes of vomiting, diarrhea, and joint aches. She had lumps on her body. As it had Hodges, the spring thaw in Alberton brought the Garst and Shuggs to a point of crisis. On April 1st, the Montana Kaimin ran an editorial calling for answers to residents' concerns, something the Missoulian editorial board never did. Despite the environmental test results, people were sick, wrote the Kaimin. MRL should push the EPA to do more tests, especially now that the spring thaw could be causing more problems, they wrote. At this point, the only leverage victims had to push an investigation was the media. Many spill victims had long complained of a perceived bias by the Missoulian. But while the Missoulian paid little attention to health issues after residents returned home, the upcoming first anniversary of the spill prompted an extensive update, if not a journalistic investigation into ongoing complaints. On April 6, the Missoulian began a 3-part series on the aftermath of the spill, to examine what happened and what's changed over the past year, they wrote. These were the newspaper's only features on the spill since the previous summer. All articles reported only chlorine as having spilled, except for an article by Alika Rutland about claims, which elaborated that about 130,000 pounds of liquid chlorine spilled, along with 17,000 gallons of potassium cresylate. This was the first report in the Missoulian signifying that more than a small amount of cressolate had spilled. Rutland generalized that some Alberton residents contend that they are still sick and some have refused to return, before she showcased interviews with the Mayo and Shug families. Another report featured an interview with engineer John Caswell, who reported chronic physical and memory problems that made it difficult to be an engineer. Assistant engineer Bill Shutter said he still had health problems but declined to be interviewed. Another anniversary story focused on the old depot, which housed the Senior Citizen Center where a few people were interviewed. Mayor Gene Curtis acknowledged some people still had serious problems, but he felt MRL had done everything they possibly could to alleviate the situation, he said. Patty Saylor, who cooked meals at the Senior Center, felt Alberton was back to being Alberton, which became the story's headline and message. Another report followed up on a few other victims. Without naming a source, author Mia Andrews reported that, quote, a handful of families, the estimate is a dozen, have lingering health problems from the spill, seeing doctors for a list of complaints that includes digestive problems, migraine headaches, fatigue, chemical sensitivity, and more. Terry Stewart recounted her chronic illness after briefly returning home during a livestock feed and smelling a pesticide smell. Andrews neglected to report that Stewart had not been exposed during the initial evacuation. The pesticide smell was not further investigated. Andrews also updated the chronic illness of I-90 victims Sharon and Lester Miller, as well as the Wasser family of 9 Mile. Wayne Wasser told Lisa Mosca that the Missoulian withheld full reporting on spill victims. This lady from the paper interviewed all kinds of people, he said, and there was only 2 Alberton-area families that she even talked about, Wasser and Stewart. Like she said to me, half the people, I just didn't believe their stories. Wasser implied the reporter didn't report interviews she didn't believe as true. The Stewarts and Wassers also reported financial difficulties as a result of spill-related medical expenses and lost wages. MRL spokesperson Linda Frost told Andrews MRL would pay for those who have legitimate medical claims. But MRL attorney Randy Cox was quoted from a letter sent to William Rossback, attorney for Alberton victims. Absent medical opinion linking the symptoms or injuries to the derailment, MRL will not pay, and certainly has no obligation to pay those expenses. This meant that if a victim had symptoms that a doctor did not relate to the spill, which presumably included all non-classical chlorine symptoms, MRL would not cover medical expenses. This could include symptoms related to chronic sensitivity. Victims had 2 choices: settle with MRL or wait out a lawsuit. Missoulian first anniversary stories failed to investigate residents' complaints that the area was still contaminated, still smelled at times, and that the spring thaw worsened chronic symptoms because of increased off-gassing of chemicals. Though clues were sprinkled throughout the stories in the details given by interviewees, no one at the Missoulian questioned discrepancies from the official story. As the major paper in the Missoula area, the Missoulian set the tone for public perception of the spill and its aftermath. While the Montana Kaiman declared Alberton residents deserve answers, the Missoulian generally reassured that Alberton was back to normal and made no call to answer anything. The impression was cast that a handful of families, perhaps with questionable claims related to lawsuits, alleged ongoing health issues. The Missoulian's disinterest in investigating allegations surrounding the aftermath of the spill served to effectively undermine the credibility of the people complaining. In their only editorial, the Missoulian had ignored health complaints and residents' concerns about reentry, while alleging petty greed by some. Joining the EPA, Montana DEQ, and Missoula health officials, the main conduit for local media had closed the book on Alberton to its own satisfaction. Alberton was back to being Alberton. Hodges and Griffin soldiered on. ACCEH publicized spill victims' complaints with a news ad the week of April 11, announcing, 1 year later and still no justice, for an afternoon protest at MRL's Missoula headquarters. The Rally for Responsibility. Hodges dubbed the event a die-in. Mosca's camera caught the day as MRL security guards watched from the parking lot. On the grassy embankment, some 70 people stretched along a couple hundred feet, casting attenuated shadows on the road. Ban chlorine! No toxic trains! MRL poisoned us, someone chanted. Two shug teens dressed in mock hazmat suits beside a bucket of dry ice slowly danced as they stirred to drumming, singing, "We want our health back! We want our health back!" The bucket had soup written on it, with the ladles, two oars, marked with symbols for chlorine. A white vapor rose. Carried by people in gas masks, dust masks, and white suits, the sign said it all, including, "Phase out chlorine now! Is our health worth white? Chemicals kill communities." Two people carried a sheet on poles. "No more toxic trains. Remember 4/11/96 Alberton." A little blonde-haired girl held aloft, "Thanks for the toxic year. Wrecked trains equal wrecked lives. The little engine that shouldn't have." Another little girl knelt with her sign, "MRL, take responsibility for wrecking our lives. MRL poisoned us. MRL, cowards spill and run. Shame on you, MRL." Another little girl cradled a two-sided sign in both arms. "MRL, toxic chemicals. MRL makes me sick. Our health not for sale." A woman in a pink sweater held up, "Denny Washington makes us sick. It ain't safe yet. I want my garden tested. EPA abandon us." A woman with a "Montana is ignoring us" sign said to another woman, "And the doctors told me no more Alberton for you." Alberton needs help. We need emergency housing. Please do not forget the derailment victims. A woman imitated the drawing of a choking victim on her sign, which read, "Alberton, still toxic. If we aren't sick, why can't we heal? We want our health back. What about our children? Spill victim will work for justice. I need health coverage." Two people held a large sheet spiked on stanchions. "ACCEH seeking health, justice. MRL ruins lives." On the other side, Alberton Community Coalition for Environmental Health. A child handed out leaflets with "Help Me Denny" printed on it, and a woman started to sing to a Beach Boys song. "Well, since you came to town, your safety record's in the red. Help me, Denny, help me get it out of my yard." The afternoon stretched on. Near the end of the protest, as MRL employees left the parking lot after their workday, protesters migrated to the sides of the exit apron, shaking signs amid whoops and shouts. On April 12, the Missoulian briefly reported on the rally off the front page. Hodges had worried that people in Alberton would hate us, she said, and they did. But the action also engendered joy. "It was so uplifting," she said. "We had all worried about the day so much that it would cause problems, that we might get arrested, that it might give the wrong impression. But once we were out there and we got such positive feedback, everyone beeping their horn. Traffic would slow down. We were doing our little chants about, 'Danny, get it out of our yard.' People enjoyed it. People felt for one day they had a little control. They were taking something a little bit back from MRL. I think it turned into such a positive thing. Though the people who didn't come in Alberton, there was no doubt that there was a huge backlash. But we didn't care by that point. The rally was just too radical for Alberton," she said. "Now we were lumped in with," Hodges laughed, "with the hippies." She felt townfolk didn't want the attention, fearing a stigma would attach, as later happened with Libby, Montana, and asbestos. "What about people's health?" she said. "Doesn't that come first?" We all felt that we had done the right thing that day. Soon after the rally, Hodges and Griffin presented a letter at the Alberton School Board meeting urging more testing for contaminants. "The people wouldn't even look at us," Hodges said. "That lost us a lot of friends when Deb and I wrote that letter." Hodges and others would elsewhere write, "As the school year of 96-97 passed, the Alberton School lost 20 students as families moved out of the district or their children became too ill to attend school. Since the school is small and a nurse is only on campus on Tuesday afternoons, no prescription drugs, inhalers, nebulizers, etc. were allowed to be used by the students. This made it extremely difficult and dangerous for those children suffering from pulmonary problems or asthma to attend school. The protocol established was for the teacher to call the parent who would travel to the school with the needed medication and administer it to the child. In early May, one child was turning blue by the time his mother arrived at the school. The child was immediately hospitalized for 4 days, they wrote. Meanwhile, Hodges recalled, people with rentals or big mortgages live paycheck to paycheck. Those with more solid finances, even if sick, were more likely to stay. Plus, she added, not everyone was willing to acknowledge that they had physical symptoms back then. One of the old timers said to me right about the time I was leaving Alberton, he said, my symptoms were like alcoholism. You can will yourself out of this, Lucinda. That was the attitude. Buck up, girl. We've seen you go through worse. People thought it was a psychological response. And they're fine, so why isn't everybody else fine? And it's a political thing with them. You're saying the railroad poisoned us. Well, it's a railroad town. Because of that allegiance, Hodges felt Alberton townsfolk had been vulnerable to denial of their neighbor's illness. The rally, in a way, was the beginning of the end, symbolically, she said, and really for the group, because I left Alberton then. Others soon followed. That was like the last big event that we were all there. The rally was a turning point. It uplifted us, but after that, they were gone. ACCEH wrote the summer of 1997. Formerly stable families who were buying homes, working, and contributing to the community were abandoning those homes they held near and dear and leaving with nothing but the possessions they could fit into their vehicles. In one case, a family moved out of their dream home and into a school bus. This was the Garsts. The Alberton dream was over for families not taking being poisoned quietly. An obvious target during rallies was MRL owner Dennis Washington. Despite owning homes in Missoula, Washington was a virtual ghost in anything concerning the Alberton spill. Except, apparently, behind the scenes on April 11 with Governor Roscoe. A 1997 USA Today profile described Washington as a quintessential self-made man, with a reputation for never eschewing hard work or a good fight, even with his fists. People ask me how I stay thin, Washington said. I say, did you ever see a fat coyote? Raised by his grandmother in Missoula next to the railroad tracks, Washington started his own construction company in 1967 at age 33. His big payoff came in 1985 when he bought the historic Anaconda copper mine from Arco, which had lost $100 million on the failing operation. The god of good timing smiled upon Washington. After a costly startup and heavy losses, the price of copper doubled and his wealth soared. Washington became heir apparent to the Montana Copper Kings, if as an entrepreneurial scavenger. He made the cover of Forbes in 1989. In the 1990s, Washington held operations in construction, mining, and transportation. In 1996, while Alberton residents ran for their lives, Washington rescued Morrison Knudsen Corporation from bankruptcy and made it profitable again. A few years after the merger, MK acquired Raytheon Engineers and Constructors to become Washington Group International Incorporated, with 38,000 employees in 43 countries. CEO Washington assured, I am here for the long haul. In 1996, Washington was a 62-year-old multi-billionaire, the richest native of Montana. But for most Missoulians, Washington was an exotic rumor. Despite gated homes up nearby creeks, he spent most of his time in Palm Springs, California. He seldom made local news when it wasn't about business or charity and gave few interviews. If you didn't know him, you didn't know him. Washington never gave a public statement concerning his railroad's derailment and the Alberton toxic chemical spill, and many victims took Washington's silence personally. This was his train, his mess. Where was Washington, they asked. Washington wasn't a target of animosity due to his immense wealth. The Responsible Party had a local name attached to it, and Missoula-area people were his neighbors, one reason why folks expected a personal response. But no appearance followed, no statement came, no comforting words, much less an apology to those who suffered the consequences of the spill. This silence bred resentment. Washington was absent, but his influence ran deep. Some spill victims referred to Missoula as a Denny Washington town. Hodges, mistrustful of local doctors, would say, in every waiting room in this town, there is a picture of an MRL train engine. Roger Chalmers thought Washington's philanthropy wonderful in itself, he said, But when you know the rest of the story, you'd like to see him take care of the people he injured. That spring, the Shugs, too, left Alberton forever. "This thing has just changed our whole lives," Steve Shug told Mosca in 1999. With the family's chronic illness, the Shugs' finances spiraled downward. "Alberton was the most beautiful place I had ever seen," Nancy recalled. "I wanted to raise our family there, and we were hoping to buy property." Prior to the spill, Steve had a good-paying job as a tool maker. "Some weeks," he said, "I put in more than 100 hours. I loved my work." He had made machine tools. "The thing is now, no matter how much I love my work, because of the chemical smells and things like that," he trailed off. By the summer of 1997, Nancy said, they were forced to settle with MRL for a small amount. "When we settled," Steve said, "our motel expenses, our clothes, our food that we had to go eat in restaurants came right off the top. Where's the fairness there?" 4 days after settling, Nancy said, "we got letters in the mail that say, yes, we were disabled. And they disabled us from 4/11/96 to the time that we applied. But their disability payments denied immediate medical coverage, and they were denied private health insurance. And our attorney never told us," she said, "Steve is going to have to wait 2 years for medical attention. Anything before that 2 years, you're going to have to pay for in full." Since that time, we have continued to see doctors, and our health problems have stayed the same. For myself, 6 medications is what they have narrowed me down to. Long life term. At least with disability payments, they weren't out on the street. Nancy was saddened by the separation from the Alberton community she had adopted. The Shugs knew many families with similar health problems. Steve said, "Everyone I know has been diagnosed with reactive airways disease, whether they smoked or had asthma or never smoked or had asthma a day in their life. I feel there should have been much more testing done." "I think Dennis Washington should have gotten in specialists," Nancy said. "That should have been the very first thing they did, and said, let's set up a clinic then for these people." Steve and Nancy Shug remained angry and frustrated that they could go to bed healthy one day and wake up changed forever by something not their fault. But it was somebody's fault. For somebody to be able to take that away from somebody is almost like going out and putting a knife in them and killing them, as far as I'm concerned, Steve said. Then the fact that he, Washington, doesn't want to take responsibility for the accident and treat this thing the way it should be treated just upsets me all the more. MRL is hoping that people can't prove that their neglect has caused these illnesses, he said. Plain and simple fact of the matter is, me and my family was as healthy as can be. On April 11th, 1996, we woke up and all that changed. As for Kim Garst, who among her family seemed most affected by the spill, a doctor's note suggested her mental state worsened by late 1997, and she suffered from suicidal feelings and delusional thinking in recent months. But by then, Garst had been through a long nightmare, losing her health, her job, and her home, which went into foreclosure, and soon her family. None of these calamities were delusions. Like others, Garst's litigation dragged along for years. In August 1999, Garst made the cover of the Missoula Independent. The photo article spread was called "The Many Faces of Homelessness, Portraits of Women on Missoula Streets," and reported that Garst had owned a 6-figure, 2-story log home on Ponderosa Acres, and a year after the spill was sleeping in Missoula parks with her 2 children in foster care. She still suffered chronic symptoms, including migraines, nausea, and fever, and was unable to work at various jobs because of sensitivity to chemicals. Her goal was to get my family back and have a house again, she said. Garst was photographed sitting on MRL's rail line in downtown Missoula, near the site of Dennis Washington's future 70th celebrity birthday bash. A year after the spill, for some, a second evacuation took place. The Shugs and the Garsts left. Though Hodges hadn't lost her home, she abandoned all attempts to live there. The Griffin family would leave later that year. The Chalmers faced foreclosure. Others, almost all undocumented by the media and government, had already left. In the spring of 1997, the Alberton school superintendent reported a net loss of 14 students, a drop of 6%, pinching the budget. "Last year we lost some that never came back, and we think that it may be because of the spill, Superintendent Rob Much said. I've tried to make that argument to MRL, and they dispute that and say we can't prove it. Mainly because no agency was tracking. By 1998, Hodges estimated that 75 people, some 23 families, had left the Alberton area because of economic and health reasons related to the spill, including 3 of 5 families on her block. She knew of others gone, but they had disappeared without her hearing the reasons. Elsewhere, ACCEH claimed to have tracked 36 families affected by the spill, comprising 102 people who left their home for 1 year or longer. But no one really knew the number of people who left or lost their homes because of the spill. There was no official accounting, nor of those who stayed and suffered. There should have been a system in place immediately to track those people, by the railroad or the agencies that should have had that responsibility, Hodges said. ACCEH had tried to keep track of the community, she said, because whether they are there or not, they're still our community. They're still exposed. They're still victims. And they deserve all the same treatment as those people who have stayed. Treatment, as it were. Mosca interviewed Terry Hermas, a volunteer for the Mineral County Crisis Hotline, a state-funded service that helped people in emotional distress. Hermas said that after the spill, the hotline had about a 30% increase in calls about depression, families falling apart, families in crisis. Some callers considered suicide. Much of the stress and shame stemmed from people not being able to work because of illness and feeling ridiculed for not working. For some, it took months before they admitted a connection between their illness and the spill. The hotline offered a non-judgmental ear, if nothing else. What we do is just let them tell their story and listen and believe, Hermas said. And sometimes that's all a person needs, is to be believed. But they needed others to believe in them as well. No official ever contacted the crisis hotline to coordinate help for the spill victims. The hotline only learned of ongoing problems as victims called and through ACCEH. Many doctors and officials dismissed lingering health concerns as being all in the head, failing to recognize and address that not only did victims have chronic physical illness, many psychological issues also stem from the spill, including the trauma of being sick, yet disbelieved, and the further crisis of failing finances from being ill. In the head or not, the pain was real, and the cause was the spill. A year had passed, bringing perspective. Hodges and others would write in the summer of 1997, "The return home is an ongoing process for everyone affected by the chemical spill. Some will never return home. Each family has had to attempt to find their own way through this disaster, often with few resources, mounting medical bills, or with no medical treatment at all. As victims try to determine their futures, they are also in the process of trying to determine if returning home is possible, or if home will ever be the safe place that it once was," they wrote. Somewhere close to paradise. For such families, everything had changed, but in their search for answers and solutions, nothing seemed to move forward. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. A year and a half after the spill, Alberton spill victims get their first meeting with ATSDR and their first chance to vent complaints at a public meeting since their return home. But Lucinda Hodges and others are shocked to find that ATSDR has already planned an upcoming follow-up health study without input from the residents. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.